back to Muhammad Ibrahim, who's an Egyptologist. And again, I feel like he carries a lot of weight because he hangs out with all of these mainstream Egyptologists. And again, he believes that the pyramid and the obelisk were most likely, operating as huge antennas. And he talks about how his colleagues, mainstream Egyptologists, they have an answer to explain almost every question about ancient Egypt, except, he says, the function of the obelisk. And I found this really interesting because when you consider some of the biggest obelisks in Egypt, it's the Hatshepsut obelisk, I think, at Karnak. It's like one solid piece of rose granite, again, the hardest granite. And it's more than 20 meters long and it weighs more than 700 tons. And then you've got the unfinished obelisk, which is just incredible to see. It's over 1,200 tons. But Muhammad Ibrahim talks about how he believes there was ultrasonic cutting, basically via sound waves, to make these.
This is the episode that's going to put us all on the map right here. That's what I'm thinking.
This is it.
This has got to be it.
So you guys started this show, what was it? Was it September of last year? Is that when you started this?
August or September, I think.
Awesome. I've been enjoying it. It just kind of, you guys came out of nowhere and here it is, Blurry Creatures.
Yeah, it's a thing, man.
Nate, why don't you talk about how it all happened?
It happened 2 years ago. I came up with the name Blurry Creatures, and then it took me a while to find Luke.
You called out to him in the force. I could hear it now. Luke.
Yeah, it was weird. Nate was just started like, hey, you want to do a Bigfoot podcast? I was like, yeah, actually, I do. I really do want to do that.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm. It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Today we're going real BC, guys. 9,000 BC, talking about pyramids, megaliths. Welcome to the show again, Dr. Judd Burton, and our new friend, Derek Olson from Megalithic Marvels. It's good to have you guys on the show today. Man, how you guys doing?
Doing great.
Doing wonderful.
On our show, we've been talking about the ancient giants. We've been talking about a lot of ancient history. We haven't really gotten into detail about the megaliths or the pyramids, and I think we've been dancing around the subject. And I want to listen to some of your guys' theories on who do you think built these things? How old do you think they are? There are some stats out there that the Pyramid of Giza is 2.3 million blocks. They would have to put one block every 5 minutes for 24 hours a day for 20 years to make just that pyramid. And I think each block weighed 2 tons. So do you think that's how they did it? Like we could start it off like 20 years straight making just that one pyramid. That sounds like it would be almost impossible to do that quickly.
That theory has never really made much sense to me. There was a construction corporation back in the 70s called from Japan called the Nippon Corporation, and they were going to make a facsimile of a pyramid, not even a model that would even be comparative in terms of size, but they were just going to make a small facsimile using the methods that archaeologists for the previous several decades had been saying, well, this is how they did it. It was the old heave-ho method, ropes and pulleys and logs. And I'm not saying that there may not have been, elements of that involved. They tried to hew limestone blocks out of a quarry on the Nile and, using bronze chisels, and the chisels quickly dulled. So they had to break out, modern equipment to even begin to hew the rock and shape it. So there's fail number one right out of the box. And they tried to sledge the stones down to the banks of the Nile where they had built reed boats that, again, was one of the prevailing ideas put forth at that time about the transportation of these blocks to the actual build site. Well, they kept having problems hauling the stones down, and they would get mired down in the mud. And then so they had to bring in a crane. There's sheets number 2 and 3 to even begin to put the stones on these reed boats. And as they put the stones on the boats fell apart and sank into the Nile. So they actually had to bring out the trucks. There's sheet number 4 to actually drive the stuff to the site. And by that time, there were so many logistical problems that they just gave up. So that little Keystone Cop attempt at building, even a facsimile of a pyramid using those methods has never really held much water. And I think it speaks in great detail. At the end of the day, although we could probably quantify some building methods, we have to admit that whatever that technology that was used to build them, has been lost. We get glimmers of it. I'm always baffled, being a historian and an archaeologist myself, I'm always baffled at the end of the day that everybody is afraid to say, I don't know. It's like you have to put some sort of flag down to say that, hey, this is how they did it. This is how many people agree on how it was done. And I'm sure that Derek can speak to this from his own work, about how we get glimmers of, both from the archaeological record and the historical record, the text record, that there was some sort of technology utilized, building methods, masonry that was utilized that we no longer have.
Yeah, Derek, maybe does that spark some curiosity in you to start curating your sites and building your fan base? Of what was your journey getting into this? Was it curiosity like that, the unknown?
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of these guys, probably like you guys. I grew up, just fascinated by ancient history, dinosaurs, reading the Bible about these giants, these Nephilim, and, always asking people and just could never really get answers. And then I actually went to Egypt 2008. I went to Israel and Egypt, and I saw the massive walls by the Western Wall there. It's the Kotel tunnels of Israel, which are definitely megalithic. Mm-hmm. And then I went to Egypt, and back then I didn't even know a fraction of what I know now, but I was just blown away. And so, yeah, I love how Dr. Judd said that it's okay to say I don't know, but then I think it's you start there, and then you look at all the evidence, and you begin your research from there. And so, yeah, that's kind of my heart behind Megalithic Marvels. It's a forum, to share my own photographs, my own thoughts, research, and then create a platform to just dialogue about this stuff, because it's so incredible. These wonders constructed in the prehistoric past, I believe they still confound today's experts, and they really defy our greatest modern engineering. You mentioned, I like your stats there about the Great Pyramid, how you guys started out with that, because if Khufu, if he constructed the Great Pyramid, I think that would be about 2600 BC.
Right. Old Kingdom.
Yeah, the Old Kingdom. And when you kind of start to weigh the evidence out, that seems like a tall leap to me. Mm-hmm. Because, like you said, they would have had to set one of these multi-ton blocks, 2.5 million of them, I think, every 2 minutes. That is insane. Mm-hmm. And so what else was going on? I have some other thoughts I can share later, but you look at just even around the Great Pyramid, whether it's at Abydos or the black boxes of the Serapeum, the Sphinx, there's drill holes and saw cuts all over this area of Giza in Egypt, right? And some of these core drill holes to me are the most fascinating because Aswan pink granite is, that's some of the hardest, finest granite. Mm-hmm. Dr. Judd, you can speak more on that, I'm sure, but you find these core drill holes into this super hard Aswan pink granite, and they've even found the core pieces that were broken out of these drills. Mm-hmm. And, they're just perfectly cut in a round form. So, boy, I start to see all that, and it's like there's a lot more going on than we've been led to believe.
Even before you say, I don't know, a lot of people don't even acknowledge that like these things exist. They almost ignore the elephant in the room. It's worth saying, I don't know what the elephant in the room is, and then it's just like, there is no elephant. Do you guys feel that this subject is just ignored?
Yeah, I think to a large degree, and I've experienced this, from being a professor myself, that if there was really academic freedom, then there would be room to tend these other questions like those, such as the Pyramid of Khufu, things like the drill holes that Derek is talking about, the pink granite, and there are other stones around the world used in monuments like granite diorite. The only way that you can cut this stuff now with any sort of accuracy is to my knowledge, is with either cobalt tipped or diamond tipped drill bits. And that brings up questions as to A, did they have that kind of technology then, or B, did they have something else that did the same thing? He mentioned the elephant in the room. Here's another elephant in the room. There are these gaping holes in our knowledge about monuments like the Great Pyramid and its age, which I also think is greatly underdated. When Dr. Robert Schoch came along and dropped the bomb on all of us that the weathering around the Sphinx enclosure was caused by water and not wind and sand erosion from the desert. Well, the last time there was enough water in Egypt to do that kind of erosion was in this period we were talking about before the show, that transitional period between the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene epoch. And I think Schoch now, at first he dated it to about 7,000 BC, and he's pushed it all the way back to 10,000 BC now. And that has ramifications for all the monuments of Giza, but especially ones like the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. I'm sure that Derek could also speak to those, having done extensive research on those monuments. But yeah, and I can't tell you how many textbooks they stand firm on this idea that the oldest civilizations were the fourth millennium ones, the so-called hydraulic despotisms, the Mesopotamian civilization, the Egyptian civilization, and that of the Indus River Valley, when clearly, if we're to use those same criteria to say what a civilization is and is not, there were prehistoric city-states that fall under those categories as well. But again, these get shoved to the periphery, despite the fact that the way that scientific archaeology, scientific history is supposed to work is that when you find something new that corroborates an idea that you had before, then go with it. If you find evidence that contradicts it and it mounts up, if it's honest and genuine science, if it's valid science, then you logically have to make that change, that amendment to.
It just becomes a new part,
exactly.
Right? Where they just place it aside. Yeah, and those listening, like, we're a creatures podcast, and what we get into is how does the creatures fit into this? And Luke and I constantly are going back in time trying to figure out, where does Bigfoot come from? And that's where the giants comes in. And those listening, I think all of us can agree that the giants enters into the conversation when we're talking about this stuff. Do you guys find, Judd and Derek, that the giants part of the story is completely ignored? And are they either the entities producing these megaliths or a big part of it?
I think there's definitely a connection. I was just did an interview with Hugh Newman, who's been to Egypt a lot, and I was asking him this question. We were talking about giants, and I was asking him if there's, what is your belief on the connections of megaliths and maybe ancient giants? And when it comes to Egypt and the Great Pyramid, he's obviously a guy who believes in giants. He wrote Giants on Record, which is a great book. And he was saying that he believes most likely that the builders of the pyramid, in his view, could have been the followers of Horus, who predated the dynastic Egyptians, but they were, they came right after, the demigods of the Golden Age, or, the Nephilim hybrids, if you want to call them that. So maybe they were a couple generations removed, but they had this knowledge, advanced technology. So I found that interesting that he mentioned them as the followers of Horus. And I haven't done a lot of research on that myself. But I find it interesting that there's depictions in oral traditions about a king His name is Keskamwe of Egypt, and he ruled about the end of the first dynasty near Abydos and Saqqara. But the depictions and the oral traditions around King Keskamwe are that he was like an 8-foot giant. And so even, in the first dynasty, we have depictions and we have oral traditions about possible giants that were literally ruling then. And then you combine that with just other weird finds. Have you guys heard about the giant mummified finger that was found in the 80s in Egypt?
I think I've seen a photo of it.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's
I haven't heard about that.
This finger, it's mummified. It's got skin on it and this big old, fingernail, and you can even see bone coming out of the one end of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got all three joints there of like the main pointer finger, it looks like. But you measure that, apparently the guys who found this and have done the studies on it say it came off of what would be like a 16-foot tall being. Pretty crazy, so you take that, you take King Keskamwe and a lot of these depictions, you take Akhenaten. He really is somebody that intrigues me because he has this elongated conical skull and these very weird features, right, that are depicted all over in Egypt. He ruled about 1380 BC.
Yeah.
During the 18th dynasty, I think it was the New Kingdom period, but yeah, reliefs show him with this long skull. He's got these really large legs and extended chin, high cheekbones, and like slanted eyes, which some would say are like serpentine looking features. And then you look at depictions of his children. They have these really long, elongated skulls, which, at first glance appear that this is more than cranial headboarding. Because the elongation is maybe 25% larger than a normal looking skull or something. I'm just guessing. But again, you take all of that and you go, man, definitely more going on than we know.
So if we're talking about the followers of Horus, and we're going to play this into the arc of sort of where our show's been, Nate, if we're to take that the giants came from, from the Watchers and from the sons of God, is it your guys' opinion, especially maybe Derek, and let's start with Derek here, that not only are these things way older than they're presumed by traditional academia, but like Derek, do you start there where you're like, okay, like if we're going back past the dynastic stuff into the even earlier Egyptian days, are we talking about technology that was gifted to man from there, and that's when the pyramids were built, and then it happened to be there during the reign of Khafre and Khufu and everybody else who supposedly built these monuments for whatever they might be?
Yeah, I think I lean towards all of that, Luke. A lot of the temples we see around Egypt were likely repurposed by the dynastics who found them thousands of years later, right? I lean towards the pyramids being, the pyramids and the Sphinx and a lot of these structures, man, being tens of thousands of years older than the dynastic Egyptians. And so a guy I follow, he's an Egyptologist. He was born and raised right there in Giza's Muhammad Ibrahim. He does a lot of tours and such. And he subscribes and talks a lot about Chris Dunn's. He's the author of the Giza Power Plant. Mm-hmm. And so, there's just a lot of fascinating theories around that they'll talk about real quick. So in a sense, and again, I like to listen to the guys that live in Egypt and are, natives of Egypt, right? And grew up reading hieroglyphs. And Muhammad Ibrahim is one of these guys who he was trying to, go the mainstream route and just be all scientific about all this stuff. But he says that the evidence is so overwhelming, he's fallen on this side of things as he's seen it himself his whole life. And he's felt, the energetic vibrations that you can still experience at some of these obelisks and such. And so he basically believes that, the Great Pyramid and, these obelisks, they're basically like huge antennas that basically channel cosmic rays. And so in the ancients, tens of thousands of years ago, ancient days, this would somehow release power and energy upon, the region or the city. Chris Dunn, his book, The Giza Power Plant, he concludes that, the Great Pyramid was probably built by a highly technical society, with energy And so in short, it was in a sense kind of like a large machine with holistic energy, again, that harmonically somehow coupled with earth. And one of his big, what he would say, proofs of this is when you look at the Grand Gallery, which is just this architectural masterpiece because of its geometric design. And you guys, I believe, you're all musicians, and so you'll appreciate this. But have you ever heard the sounds, the harmonics when you're in the Grand Gallery and how they just it's acoustic resonance? And so when you go through that passageway, it leads to the antechamber and then to the king's chamber. But there's basically, when you're going through the Grand Gallery, there's basically 27 pairs of these slots that are cut into the ramp that goes up. And so Dunn believed that these slots basically held some kind of resonator. And that sounds, crazy and far out, right? But then they've found possible evidence to support this speculation, but that there's these scorch marks on the walls of the Grand Gallery just in these specific spots. And if you look close, they almost look like impact craters through which something exploded or something happened. And that, really impacted the pyramid in ways they think it was a great earthquake, but it was likely it could have been some kind of explosion. And so, again, when you look at the pyramid, you can see all this heat damage inside on the corbelled layers. That's just interesting. Again, a lot of speculation, but also you look at the evidence objectively and you go, man, is there something to this where this generated energy somehow?
I like the way that Jared Diamond puts it in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He talks, which is basically a history of the world. And he talks about basically the apex of the book is the meeting of the old world and the new world. And I'm using this example to illustrate the significance of the change that takes place from the point when we were, as a species, hunter-gatherers for millions of years. And then almost in, just in terms of geologic time, almost overnight, we go to be, these city-dwelling, megalith-building people, or at least it's another option for social organization. And what Jared Diamond argues in the meeting of the old world and the new world, and the reason that the old world was able to conquer the new world, say in the 1500s, is that there were so many elements of geography and epidemiology and cultural advancement that took place in Eurasia because it was long east to west and the Americas were long north to south, and so it was harder for that information to spread. And so the old world had this jump on the gun basically in terms of developing weaponry, in terms of developing basic elements of civilization that put them in a place to be militarily and epidemiologically to overtake and change the culture of the New World very drastically. And that's the point that I'm making, is that when the Spanish come over, the change to native culture in the 1500s is cataclysmic and it's irreparable. You can't change the trajectory that it's on by that point because you had this vastly technologically superior force that exerted these influences for both good and ill over the culture of the Americas. And that's why I think, using that same sort of logic, you can apply that to what happens with the Watchers. Here you have this celestial cabal essentially bringing in exchange for genetic access to the human species. They provide all of this information that drastically alters the cultural trajectory of humanity. And I think a lot of the megalithic structures in the world, I think a lot of the questions that we still have about technologies that were used to render them and even other technologies stem from that outside influence. And so I suppose you could call that a kind of cosmic guns, germs, and steel theory, but the logic holds. And there are other examples too, like the cargo cults in the South Pacific. Once they were exposed to all of the airdropping of supplies and airplanes and things like that, it completely reoriented their culture, and it was never the same after that.
One thought I have with all this, and maybe you guys can see if you're tracking with me, is that over time the giants kind of breed out of the population, right? There's a time when they're larger, and it seems like over time from all of our episodes, they go from, some say 20 foot, maybe bigger, all the way down to 6, 7, 8 foot. Do you think that in the same way the knowledge, as if the giants are getting breeded out, maybe some of this knowledge that they have, this supernatural knowledge, is slowly dying out?
Yeah, Nate, I think I would agree with that. Yeah, I think there was, some kind of obviously golden age and lost ancient technology handed down right from the Watchers to mankind in exchange for, the ability to, as Genesis and the Book of Enoch would tell us, right, breed with women, and they would in turn give mankind, these sacred sciences, as Gary Wayne would talk about. And yeah, we know with all over the earth, every civilization talks about some great cataclysm or flood, and with that, I think came some, obviously secret knowledge that thousands of years removed, you start to lose. The crazy part is, we've got the Bible that speaks about giants, and we've got other ancient manuscripts, the Book of Enoch. We've got historians like Josephus talking about giants. We've got literally newspaper articles from the 1800s, early 1900s talking about giant skeletons being found. Sardinia is an island that just fascinates me because not only are there megaliths there with these Naragi towers, and to me, one of the most fascinating megalithic sites on Earth is the Well of Santa Cristina. I don't know if you've seen a picture of that. It was named after a Catholic church which is nearby, but this is a trapezoidal subterranean well-looking structure made with clear advanced technology. It looks very similar to kind of what you'd see in the Grand Gallery, actually, of the Great Pyramid. But all that to say, you listen to the oral traditions of the people that still live there. One of the most fascinating things about Sardinia is they're called the tombs of the giants that are found all over this island. And these are massive tombstones and graves that are literally, 15 feet long and really wide. But again, I'm saying all that to set up the fact that their own oral traditions, people still alive today talk about the giants they saw when they were kids, the giant skeletons that have since been removed. And so to me, that's fascinating that you have not just newspaper articles, but you have firsthand accounts from people still alive that they saw giant skeletons, back in the day, right? And so to me, that just adds to the whole narrative. You've got ancient manuscripts, you've got old newspaper articles, now you have firsthand accounts. And then to me, to answer your question, Nate, all these crazy elongated skulls we see. I went to Paracas, Peru, a couple years ago with Brian Forster, and I saw, I got to see these up close. I think Dr. Judd, I know you have as well. And you look at this, and to me, there's got to be a connection here, where, yeah, maybe the giants got smaller and shorter, but somehow there's a connection with these crazy elongated skulls we see in the Black Sea region and then Peru. They've clearly got genetic anomalies surrounding them. There's no way that cradle headboarding can create that. Cradle headboarding can obviously change the shape of a skull. It cannot add more cranial mass. And these skulls clearly have a lot more cranial mass. And so to me, that's part, I guess, the way I would answer your question, Nate, is I think when we look at those, we're looking at, I don't have all the answers, but some connection there with the offspring of the Watchers. Here we can look at them and touch them today.
Derek, I told L.A. Marzulli and some of the other people that I worked with down there is that I came away with more questions than I did answers, far more questions. And that was the big one, is that if they were emulating their earliest kings, what did these kings look like? Because clearly they were not your typical, anthropomorphic, humanoid fashion we would see as human. Clearly they were trying to pay homage to something that was other. It might have had human in it. And I talked with Nate and Luke a couple of weeks ago about a new paper that I wrote touching on that subject, that these god kings culturally engineered elements of language, elements of our technology so forth. And there was this tradition that you can read about, not just it shows up in the Mesopotamian material, where there's a reverence to the long dead god kings in the Apsu, the abyss. And then it shows up especially in the Ugaritic material that the Phoenicians recorded, in the Rosh Hashanah text. There's a funerary cult where they're actually paying homage to these long dead ancestor kings. They have to placate them, gain their favor, gain knowledge from them, called the Rapa'umi, which is morphemically similar to Rephaim in the Old Testament. You're basically looking at the same morpheme and cognate. And then, of course, in the Mesopotamian material, it's Rabbah or Rapha, which shows up in names like Hammurabi and Amraphel. But it too means prince or ruler. Clearly, these people were emulating these long dead god kings. So these semi-divine creatures that I think the first rendering of giants after this great cataclysm, the deluge, the flood, whatever people want to call it, these are the ones that sort of reboot the Watcher tech, and it begins to proliferate, particularly in the Neolithic period.
In the long dead god kings, a lot of people, besides the ideas that pyramids are generators and power source, a lot of people say that they would put obviously the dead kings inside of them with all their possessions. What do you guys think about some of those theories that they're like a holding place for the dead kings themselves?
I mean, from my research, I don't believe any mummy or dead pharaoh was ever found inside the Great Pyramid. And so I think most researchers would admit to that. So, I mean, right there, you've got to ask yourself, okay, what's going on? If this was built as a tomb for a pharaoh, why wasn't a pharaoh ever found? I think most likely, again, they were repurposed. And the dynastic Egyptians found these superstructures that they knew were from a lost epoch and made with advanced tech, and repurposed them as a burial chamber as they broke inside, and they found these passageways. I think an example of this are the black boxes of the Serapeum and Saqqara. To me, these are one of the most enigmatic things in all of Egypt, because the Serapeum is like this labyrinth. I think it was discovered about 1850, and inside underground were these 25 black granite boxes. They're cut with, it sounds crazy, I know, but laser-like precision, right? I mean, these things weigh, the boxes are 70 tons and the lids are 30 tons, I believe. So it's about 100 tons total. And they were found empty. And, but you'll find on like 2 or 3 of them are some really crude hieroglyphics, which were clearly added thousands of years later and don't even match the precision of the boxes themselves. And so I think that's an example of repurposing, where at first glance you might say, oh, well, the Egyptians made these because there's hieroglyphs on the side, and they were for burial chambers for bulls, as I think mainstream Egyptologists would say. But again, you look at all of the evidence, and there's a lot more questions than answers. For example, the enclosures where these crazy boxes are found are about 2 feet wider than the boxes themselves. And these boxes are so heavy, they would have needed a vast army of men to transport them, right? But there's no way they could move them through the skinny tunnels, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the stone that was used to make these boxes was quarried from Aswan. Again, we talked about that pink granite, which is like the finest, hardest material in Egypt. That's over 500 miles away. And so how would they move these 100-ton boxes, 25 of them, into this enclosure? And then there's no fire marks found on the roof of this enclosure. And when you look at the enclosure, and maybe you guys can link some pictures in the show notes, I don't know, but the enclosure looks really crude compared to the boxes, right? And there's no fire marks on the roof, which they would have needed light to see what in the heck they were doing. So to me, that's a great example of these were probably here tens of thousands of years earlier. Dynastic Egyptians found them, built this enclosure over them, and there you go.
I was looking at those black boxes. It's crazy. Like they barely fit inside these little rooms, and they were showing, we'll have to link these notes or these pictures because they're taking and showing the angles on these things, which is like perfect 90 degree. I mean, it looks, you're right, like laser cut.
And one thing we talk a lot about on our show is acoustic frequencies. several guests have talked about this, and it seems like the ancients understood sound better than anyone. Do you think sound is how they moved everything? They could tap into the resonance of blocks. It seems like there's some sound technology that we don't even understand.
There's so many things about the pyramids as well, like especially the Great Pyramid. If you ever breaking down the mathematics that they find inside of this, it's incredible. Like the dimensions of it, the fact that it's perfectly situated to the cardinal points. It's perfectly situated halfway between the North Pole and the equator. It's perfectly situated on these spots on Earth, and then also if you multiply it by these certain numbers, you can fit the Earth, right inside of it, and it has mathematical terms associated with it weren't discovered till the 16th century. They use pi. They use all these crazy math that didn't exist until what we consider modern times, and the precision to which even it's laid out. I think you kind of, like Derek, you kind of alluded to that in the beginning, the way that the whole place is set up. It just it blows your mind, like, to think that the traditional history would say we're a bunch of cavemen that became hunter-gatherers, and somehow all this stuff was created that we can't figure out how they actually did it, and it's mathematically perfect, and they knew all these things about the Earth and the Moon and the dimensions of the Earth and the measurements that they weren't supposed to have already, along with mathematical quotients they weren't supposed to have already.
Our comfort level has sort of been conditioned to, when we hear the word Stone Age, we immediately think of leather-clad brutes, hunting down megafauna, and they certainly did that. But these weren't unsophisticated people. And as to Nate's point too, was there some understanding of sound and vibration? I think that's part of the stone technology equation that often gets left out of any sort of analysis of a given group from the so-called various stages of the Stone Age. The go-to part for archaeologists for Stone Age technology, of course, is the lithic technology, the making of flint tools and knives and things like that, which is certainly important. But it leaves out this whole world of understanding that these people obviously had about the piezoelectric properties of rocks, the acoustic properties of rocks, the resonant properties of rocks. And if they were able to harness this knowledge, whether it was taught to them by the Watchers or the giants or whomever, if they're able to harness this, then it's not outside. Things like levitating, heavy stones is not outside the realm of possibility, because we know that we can do that, in a microcosmic fashion in laboratory science today. It's very clear that the people of the Stone Age were sophisticated because they weren't intellectually compartmentalized, for one thing. And whether this is the part of the natural flow of knowledge or it has to do with the tutelage that generations prior had received from watchers and the first generation of giants, what it speaks to is their culture, their mythology was a sea, an ocean on which all of their bodies of knowledge floated. And so they didn't have the sort of, horse blinder approach to dividing bodies of knowledge that we do in the modern world. And so as they would pay homage to their gods that they associated with stars and the movements of stars and celestial bodies, they're able to also extrapolate mathematics up to, higher order mathematics approaching calculus. Well, if you can do that, then you can apply that knowledge to engineering. And I think that's what allows a lot of the megalithic structures to be positioned the way that they are, and in some cases rendered the way that they are, because there's this facet of knowledge of stone technology that clearly is being left out of any sort of analysis of these megalithic structures. Like I said, without fail, the go-to technological analysis in anthropology and archaeology today is to look at the lithic part of that, the making of stone cutters and scrapers and mallets and knives and spear points and things like that. Not the other possibilities of an actual geological technology that these people were more than likely aware of.
I mean, are we all on agreement that humans didn't build these? It doesn't sound like humans built them.
I think human labor was involved in the building of some of them, but I think that let's just put it this way. I think your engineers and your foremen were either watchers and giants or some combination. But that's not to say that later generations of giants weren't used in the construction of some of these megalithic structures.
Yeah, I would agree with that totally, how Dr. Judd set that up about human labor. And again, back to the repurposing theory with the dynastic Egyptians, when we consider, the Hebrews in Egypt, it's most likely that they were serving, the pharaohs again who found these structures or repurposing them and were using, slave labor to do it, right? But to Nate's question about like sound resonance, I had a thought back to Muhammad Ibrahim, who's an Egyptologist. And again, I feel like he carries a lot of weight because he hangs out with all of these mainstream Egyptologists. And again, he believes that the pyramid and the obelisks were most likely, operating as huge antennas. And he talks about how his colleagues, mainstream Egyptologists, they have an answer to explain almost every question about ancient Egypt, except, he says, the function of the obelisk. And I found this really interesting because when you consider some of the biggest obelisks in Egypt, it's the Hatshepsut obelisk, I think, at Karnak. It's like one solid piece of rose granite, again, the hardest granite, and it's more than 20 meters long and it weighs more than 700 tons. And then you've got the unfinished obelisk, which is just incredible to see. It's over 1,200 tons. But Muhammad Ibrahim talks about how he believes there was ultrasonic cutting, basically via sound waves, to make these. And how when you look at the obelisks, you'll see these thin brown colored lines in different places on them. And he believes these are left behind from the cut marks or whatever the ancient machining they were using that was using high levels of heat. And he would equate it to today, we actually use sound waves via ultrasound to help cure people of like kidney stones and other physical issues. So he's saying, again, back then with this lost knowledge, that he believes they were using some type of sound waves, ultrasonic cutting, to create a lot of these structures, at least these obelisks. And when you look at the unfinished obelisk, this massive 1,200 ton one that's still laying in the quarry because it cracked, you'll see that there's these scoop marks in it. Again, you study the scoop marks, and again, it's kind of similar to what you might see in Peru in some places, but it would suggest, again, some kind of resonance. And then when you look at the details of some of the hieroglyphs on these obelisks, like the eyes of some of the characters in these hieroglyphs, they're so small and so fine, it would require almost some kind of nanotechnology because these are smaller than a finger. And to have an archaic tool, again, the impossibilities of making that so precise are pretty obvious, right? So there's no way it could have been done by a hammer and a chisel. And a lot of people say, including Muhammad Ibrahim, you can actually feel vibrations if you touch these obelisks at Karnak. Again, which is crazy. But again, if you believe that it's some kind of power antenna channeling atmospheric energy, it would basically pass it to the granite floors, and then it would power these surrounding temples possibly. So pretty crazy stuff to consider.
Where in your mind are the best examples that these things pre-exist and were probably repurposed by the people that we associate or science associates with them with now, or even history associates them with now?
Really all over the world in certain places. Peru would be one of the big ones aside from Egypt, right? I mean, it's just chock full. It's a megalithic paradise, basically. You could go there 100 times and barely scratch the surface. Dr. Judd, I'm sure you would agree on just the megaliths there. And most people think of Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo when they think of the megaliths in Peru. But I mean, some of the most fascinating ones are off the beaten path. When I went there, one of the most fascinating sites I visited was Brian took us to this really remote cave. And this was in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And so again, the Sacred Valley is kind of northwest of like Cusco. And you drive up to Machu Picchu, you see Ollantaytambo, but way off the beaten path in this mountainous ravine. And we hike up the face of this mountain range. And I'm talking, it was way up there. And as you're getting higher, you start to see, what's probably Inca ruins, right? Rough, small stone with mortar. It's cool, but it's, it looks like it's not super old. And way up in the distance, you see this cave. And stepping inside once you get up to this cave was literally mind blowing, because inside was incredible precision megalithic architecture that you would see just like at Sacsayhuaman or Machu Picchu, right? But in a remote cave, which is absolute proof there's no way they brought power tools up here, right? And so, but you step into this cave and literally this one wall cut into the face is like what looks like a door into another world. Precision cut. It's probably 100 feet wide, I'm guessing. And there's a faux doorway. But even crazier, on the other end of the cave was what looked like a console or altar, literally out of a sci-fi movie. Now, the top was blown off from people 100 or so years ago, which is really unfortunate because it'd be incredible to see what this console looked like. But, I mean, it was almost like it had seats you could sit in. The site is called Nuapahaka, I believe, if people want to Google that. But to me, that was some of the most incredible proof, way in a mountainous cave, way up in the Andes Mountains, that there was a lost technology that probably predates the Inca. And then I would say another example of other sites around the world is just some of the Cyclopean stuff we see in Greece and even Italy is it's because it's like its own style, right? Like Egypt's cool, and obviously the Peruvian stuff is cool, but man, the Cyclopean stuff is really amazing in its own right. It's polygonal. And when you consider the oral traditions in some of the writings of the Cyclopean architecture, many believe these were built by giant cyclops, which could have been a Nephilim hybrid type creature, right? And not a big dumb ogre per se, but these were thought to be serious artisans who actually lived under the earth and were like master stonemasons and metallurgists, and who retained somehow knowledge of the early gods. So you can see their work in Greece, Italy, and even some on Sardinia. So those are some examples. Yeah,
we posted some articles of Cyclops skulls being dug up that were specifically Cyclops. They weren't a mastodon skull, because a lot of people, they dig up a mastodon skull and they say, oh, it's a Cyclops because it's got the hole in the middle of the skull. But this was specifically a Cyclops. So that's interesting. Not to get too weird here, because everyone goes into the ancient alien things, but this kind of reminds me of when they brought Bob Lazar to Area 51, if you subscribe to any of that, and his job was trying to figure out these anti-gravity spheres. We have this technology of propulsion, and theirs was like you sit in this, alien craft, and it pulls you into the there's like a gravity bend, and they produce the energy right out of thin air. They don't have gas, fuel. They're not building rockets. They're pulling their energy right from the surroundings. And it seems like if you're up in this cave, I'm just kind of using my mind here, you have to be able to tap into the energy that's right there. If these entities are behind the UFOs, maybe they're the ones who were behind this technology to pull energy right out of thin air.
It's interesting regarding my experience up in that cave in the Sacred Valley. There was a crazy thing that happened when we were up there, because I was with this group of people, right? Obviously, I subscribe to the biblical worldview of things. But if you don't, you can be open to all kinds of stuff, right? Up in this cave, they basically started doing a song and dance that was welcoming some kind of, what they said, spirits, right? And so I'm thinking, oh man, where is this going to go, right? Basically, they had people that were, of Inca lineage there beating drums and chanting, and a guy in the tour group, a couple people over from me, he basically starts shaking, which again, this sounds crazy. I should state that before they started chanting, they were saying, just receive the energy and receive the power of the ancient spirits and stuff like that. Okay. They start beating their drums. This guy starts basically manifesting, and he's shaking, and he's basically scared to death, and even screaming. And so it was a really weird situation, and people are kind of like, what's going on? And people started grabbing him, and what's going on? Are you okay? And this guy, he comes out of this, and he basically describes how he had this crazy experience where he saw this, I believe he said it was a panther descend through the portal in the cave and come into him. I was just sitting there just like, what did I just see? And does this maybe explain a little bit of the purpose of why that was created? I don't know, but I thought that was a really crazy experience.
Well, I think too that you likely know this, Derek, that, caves in particular have been considered by many cultures over space and time to be openings to the underworld. And a lot of these, well, I say a lot, but a number of these sites are clearly, they were clearly conceived to be some sort of portal to another place. Dr. Aaron Judkins and I are working on we're finishing a book actually right now on Göbekli Tepe on the Bible. And, even for people that don't subscribe to, like a biblical or supernatural worldview like we do, even the archaeologists who don't typically subscribe to that, they're all of the mind that the people that built Göbekli Tepe conceived of this as a portal to the netherworld. It shows up again and again and again in the literature. What we're left with here is a remnant of that sort of watcher technology, because these high places that were associated with the gods of antiquity, and I would argue at least late prehistory, they sort of in a way mimic the Genesis 6 event. When the Watchers actually, where do they touch down? Well, they touch down on Mount Hermon. This sets the model up for divine councils of all kinds of gods, I think, all over the world, not just in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world, but all over the world, because their gods are always associated with these high places and caves and mountain tops. It makes me think of, Zeus was raised on a cave on the top of a mountain on Crete. But just as these watchers were sort of the archetype for the divine, these divine councils of gods and their association with features like caves and mountaintops, I think that also speaks to the fact that it sets up a model in many ways for the building of these pyramidal structures that we find all over the world, whether we're talking about the Egyptian pyramids or the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, or the pyramids in Mesoamerica or South America. I think all of these structures are following this kind of blueprint, because you often have temple structures at the apex of these structures. And I think, and even going back to the literature that you find in like comparative religion, and what religious scholars say about mountains is that mountains and pyramids anyways, that pyramids in a way are mountain effigies. Some of them are made out of, in particular, I think about the Olmec pyramids in Cahokia outside of St. Louis, which were earthen pyramids, whether we're talking about hewn stone, or actual earthen pyramids. I think in a way it sort of brings us back to the Watcher event on the top of Mount Hermon as a kind of blueprint for these later pyramidal megalithic structures. What I was getting to with what religious scholars have to say about mountains is that pyramids are these mountain effigies, and they represent a kind of sacred space where the sacred and the profane realms come together. They're in the abode of the gods, but they're placed on these things that come out of the earth too. And so they represent this sort of connection between the celestial and the terrestrial. And so in the research that I've done, this is something that pops up again and again and again. I think I always go back to, I think the Mount Hermon event in many ways is at least a blueprint for many of the pyramid structures that we find around the globe.
And they're everywhere. There's some hidden in places like Montana and Antarctica.
Sure.
I mean, they're still finding them.
I've seen the Antarctica ones. I was going to ask about that. They have these pyramidal mountains that they think they found with satellites that look, and they're supposed to be massive. But I think, Judd, what you're saying is super fascinating. If you're trying to recreate and sort of man-make a mountain in that sense, in order to have the gods arrive, or I mean that makes sense, and maybe even the sense of the power plant theory, that you're creating something that's going to harness or bring this power down. And then I think when you're talking about the cave thing, it's fascinating too that like we look to the New Testament and we see Jesus went to Caesarea Philippi, and there's a cave there.
Sure.
I'm not as smart as you guys. Oh.
Well said, Luke. No, well said. I thought you nailed that. There's a really fascinating area called Elephantine Island. It's basically this granite island further south. It's down on the River Nile. It's actually known by the ancients as like the heart of Egypt, kind of an oral traditions, and that it's the source of the Nile, but not obviously in a water sense, but in that the waters are energized because they flow from underneath this island. When you go to this island, and I'm actually hoping to get to Egypt this year, I can't wait to go here because there's incredible megalithic structures on this island, again, that probably predate the dynastic Egyptians. There's these kind of like the black boxes that are at the Serapeum. There's similar broken boxes, precision cut, precision crafted, smooth as like a glass mirror. Yet you'll see they're totally like just ripped in half, like some crazy cataclysm just shook this to the core, and perfect 90-degree angles and smooth to the touch. So it's crazy what they achieved. When you go to this island, it's granite itself, but it's covered completely in like mud bricks. Again, the locals know that there's an energy emanating basically from this area. Muhammad Ibrahim even talks about how back in the day, even as far as 25 years ago, mothers in that area, they would go to have their children in some of these areas because of the healing properties, which again I know sounds crazy, but he says it's like the energy is slowly fading, and that kind of goes back to our discussion on, are we losing this knowledge? And basically it was like the power was turned off, right? Whenever this great cataclysm happened, the flood, the power source to these were turned off, and it's slowly, the remnants of it are slowly fading away. But again, the crazy thing is, if you go to this island, in some places at certain times, you can supposedly still feel magnetic vibrations and such, and see crazy megaliths, which again, to me, is part of the piece of the puzzle.
Have you heard of those energy healing tables that people lay on and they're supposed to heal you? That they say that the ancients had these tables, and they were able to live a lot longer because they would lay on these tables, and then basically all of their ailments would leave. I've had several people send me links to these healing tables, which sounds like what you were talking about. But
Judd, I got a question to follow up on what Derek just said.
Sure.
Considering our conversations that we've had, over the course of this show, if what we're talking about with these megalithic structures really has to do with energy and power and resonance and stuff, would it be a leap to assume that pre-cataclysm, the makeup of the atmosphere, the makeup of the earth, we consider to be would have been different, that these perhaps operated in that space and therefore don't operate really in the sense of what Derek is saying, if it's fading, that our current climate or whatever changed about the Terra here. You thought I don't know if that's a theory that exists out there, or I just kind of thought of that. But
no, I think that's a tenable idea, because we know that the further back in time you go, and we can tell this from a number of kinds of diagnostic assessments, ice core samples and rock stratification, sediments taken from those strata. We know that even as recent as the Pleistocene epoch, that I believe that the Younger Dryas cataclysm that takes place around that transitional period is the flood event, the Noahic flood, the deluge that Hesiod writes about, in Theogony and Oryx and Days, and the same series of cataclysms that destroyed Atlantis. I think we're talking about the same thing. We know that even the oxygenation in the atmosphere was greater at that time. It was at least 40 or 50% greater than it is right now. And the further back in geological time you go, we know that it was even greater then. And in those conditions, we know that fuller genetic expression is possible, so that, that's the reason that the megafauna were possible in the first place. Not just the mammalian quadrupeds that we had during during the Pleistocene, but going back to the time of the dinosaurs. The reason that one of the things that you notice very quickly in looking at dinosaur fossils, and I'm not a paleontologist, but I talk with these guys all the time. One of the things you notice very quickly about the dinosaurs is that they had very limited chest cavity capacity, very small compared to the rest of their body, is because there was more oxygen in the atmosphere for them to draw on, and they didn't have to work as hard. You apply that to, if in some way that greater oxygenation that which we know enriches health, if all these conditions are different, then it's possible that the technology or the monuments, whatever appellation we want to give to them, wouldn't work under present conditions, because right now the oxygen percentage in the atmosphere is about 19%.
Maybe that's what it is, Derek. Maybe we're looking at machinery and ancient machinery that was fine-tuned to work in an environment or a bygone time that now we live in. Physically, not even spiritually speaking, but physically, we live in a different earth.
So we talked a lot about the 90-degree angle construction of some of these megaliths, but the stuff in Peru that Brian Forster was talking about, it's totally different. It's one thing to build a pyramid every single block's exactly the same, and it's cut, and it's another thing to build some of these and it looks like there's no design idea at all. It's just eventually we'll get there, but every block is a different size and a different cut. What do you say about that, guys? Because that's the stuff that blows my mind, that it looks like these things were melted and set into place.
You said that well, Nate. You guys have probably heard that, oral tradition says that when the Spanish arrived in the Cusco area and they spoke to the Inca, that the Inca basically told them that, hey, we didn't build this stuff. It was built by a previous civilization. Like Brian points out so well regarding the megaliths in Peru, you can't fit a human hair through any of these joints, right? You might in some places now after cataclysms and earthquakes, but especially when these things were made originally, perfectly mortarless. Like you said, Nate, it's almost like they were able to heat the stone, melt it like a marshmallow, and then literally shape it. As far as we know, the only tools found in the archaeological record that the Inca possessed to craft stones were bronze chisels and stone hammers. And so when you have granite and andesite, which the megalithic construction is made of,
can't do it.
If you look at the Mohs scale of hardness, that's way harder than bronze. And so if you're just looking at this objectively, the Inca could not have been able to craft andesite or granite stone with softer tools, right? That would be akin to me cutting down a tree like with a plastic knife. And so the Inca most likely must have discovered this megalithic architecture ages after it had suffered through some prehistoric cataclysm. Part of what got me down this rabbit hole was, again, I was always fascinated by, ancient history. And I think it was around 2012. I was looking at, Google images of, I was probably searching ancient history. And I see my first ever image, I believe it was in 2012, of this megalithic stonework in Peru, right? It was probably Sacsayhuaman or something. And, without knowing much, I could critically think, why have I never seen this before? Like, this looks far superior than any of this other stuff I've ever seen. Why is this not in history books, And so it was so crazy for me to go to Machu Picchu, because this is one of the most iconic ancient sites in the world. And, there's usually a few main views you see of this site, with a mountain in the background. But almost all of the photos you'll see of Machu Picchu are, it's still nice in its own right, but it's the Inca construction, which is, it's small, rough stone and it's clay mortar. But as Brian would point out, the core of Machu Picchu is this incredible megalithic white granite architecture that is, when you're standing there, it stands out night and day. Like you're walking into Machu Picchu and you see all the Inca stonework, and it's small, it's rough, it's got mortar, but then you see this white granite, which is, to me, clearly predated the rest and was the original site. And Machu Picchu is known as the ancient mountain. That's what Machu Picchu basically means. And so again, this is super high up in the Andes. And there's this one piece in Machu Picchu. I think it's right under what they call the Temple of the Sun, which is again, an Inca word, but I call it the secret chamber. And unfortunately, it's closed off to the public now, or at least when I visited. But you look under this, and I've got videos of this somewhere on our Instagram and website, but it's just, again, it's the craziest looking knobs and trapezoidal cutouts. And it looks like it's a secret little temple under the Temple of the Sun. And again, you can't go in there. You can't walk around. It's roped off, but it almost looks like there's a possible entrance back there that goes further in. But again, it's another crazy example of clearly two different kinds of architecture, right? One that is way superior and probably thousands of years older than the other.
And what do you think about some of the ancient alien theories when people kind of bring in, aliens did it all? I mean, what do you say to that? I mean, how do you guys respond to these things? Because that seems to be like a movement that's growing. More and more people are they're unsatisfied with academia and their explanations. So they're moving into these, aliens came down and they built them and they're coming back soon. What do you guys say to that?
That's not that there aren't tenable ideas that come out of the sort of ancient aliens approach to all of this. One of the problems that I have is that a lot of it seems to be predicated on the work of people like Eric von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin. And this has nothing to do with degrees after somebody's name. It has to do with competency. Is that it seems like a lot of the people are so far out of their depth. They don't have the proper training to make conclusions. And again, I'm not lambasting avocational scholars, because we could make a whole show about the debt of gratitude that we owe to avocational scholars. I work with them I have worked with them abundantly in the field. People that just do archaeology as an avocation. But one simple point can illustrate how easy it is for people to get out of their depth. And that is in Zecharia Sitchin's material, which, don't get me wrong, the guy's a fantastic reader, but he's always claiming to be an expert on Sumerian and Akkadian documents. He never would produce any proof of training or credentials, and his work is just rife with all kinds of basic mistakes. I mean, all he would have to do is get a copy of some of these Sumerian and Akkadian grammars, and he would know that, for instance, Nibiru isn't referring to a planetoid that circles around every 3,600 years. Every time that Nibiru is used in Mesopotamian literature, it's a reference to Marduk's star within their astrology. Marduk's star was Jupiter. 95% of the occurrences, you can demonstrate that was a fact. And Sitchin created this entire idea based, not completely unrelated to the work that Eric von Daniken had done, and got a lot of people to jump on the bandwagon. Now, clearly we're dealing, in the case of these megaliths that we're talking about here, we're dealing with otherworldly influence. But there's also a way that you can't just jettison the scientific framework that you use to approach it. And I think people like Dr. Robert Schoch would agree with that, because it gets us the more tenable, demonstrable answers that we're looking for. In other words, we can take these deep dives into these sort of mind-blowing questions, that go outside of the academic mainstream, but to completely jettison a rational approach doesn't really get us the answers that are really tenable. Those answers may be more fantastical than the other ones that are pure speculation, that seem to be the lifeblood of a lot of the people that show up on Ancient Aliens. Von Daniken and William Henry is another one who just is completely out of his depth. His reference for approaching ancient languages, and this is a direct quote from him, I'm not kidding, are the etymology notes in the Webster's Dictionary. And his reasoning is that if it was good enough for Thomas Jefferson, it's good enough for me. What do you say to that? You can't use the Webster's Dictionary to translate Akkadian, to look at or anything else for that matter. And so, what do you say to that? I don't know. I get frustrated with a lot of what comes out of Ancient Aliens. I do like the fact that they produce these great photographs and panoramas of these sites for people to see. But heck, you got people like Derek out there who are doing a better job in bringing that kind of pictorial evidence to you, in my opinion.
Yeah. What do you think, Derek?
Thanks, Doctor. It's an interesting thing because on one hand, you've got, and again, I don't want to paint too broad of a brushstroke here, but it seems like you have the majority of Christians who, they believe in pretty crazy stuff, like, right, God spoke the earth into existence, and that Jesus was born of a virgin, and that a donkey talked, right? Yet they can't. They find it so hard to talk about the Genesis 6 narrative or giants or these kind of things, megalithic structures. And then you've got, you speak of ancient aliens. It's crazy because you've got them, you watch a lot of their episodes and they're talking about Genesis 6, right? They're talking about giants of the Bible in certain episodes. Probably they're not basing it off the biblical worldview, right? So again, it's just such a weird paradox to me. Like Dr. Judd said, I love the high budget behind Ancient Aliens as far as producing quality production level videos where you can see these ancient sites. But right, then you get a lot of guests on and it's like, it's the alien narrative, which also seems so broad to me. Yet it's like they can get close at times to a golden age. I think that we would all agree with, where the gods mingled with man, right? And where something happened that created genetic hybrids. And so it's so close, yet without the foundation of the Bible, it can be so misguided. Yet, again, you have the Christians who believe in all this crazy stuff that takes a lot of faith, but don't even want to talk about giants or the Nephilim or stuff, or don't even get it.
Don't you think we're just talking about semantics here, right? I mean, that's kind of how I see it, right? If you're coming from a secular worldview, you're talking about the same thing, you're just calling it something different.
Well, it seems like, kind of makes it sound like to me that there are people out there that they almost believe that they can believe in the virgin birth and Jesus, but they can't believe anything else outside of that. Is that kind of what you're saying? But even Ancient Aliens is talking about the giants. Even Ancient Aliens is talking about the Genesis 6 story. That there's this group of, modern day Christians who subscribe to like a 2% supernatural version of Scripture, right? And what this kind of feels like we're tapping into is that, like, it's more like 98%, and we're just scratching the surface of what technology used to exist from these beings that interacted with humanity, right? Like, right. I think when you have that 2% way of viewing Scripture, you're going to convert a lot of people over to the ancient alien religions, because they're like, the church is it's like a Ferrari going, 2 miles an hour. I just can't do it anymore. And a lot of people are trying to, it's almost like they're trying to save the church through this highly rational way of viewing Scripture, and I think it's killing it faster. That's my thought. Whereas when you bring in the Genesis 6 story, I think more people are going to show up, because they're like, finally, some answers.
Well, yeah. I don't even think it's Genesis 6, just that. I mean, read what happened after the resurrection. I mean, there's so much that's cherry-picked and glossed over. So the dead came out of their tombs and walked around in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
How often does that show up in your sermon on Sundays? It's not just Genesis 6. Yeah, it's like people pick what they're comfortable. I mean, it makes them feel comfortable and doesn't stretch them outside of their little academic box, is what I feel like. Go ahead, Jay.
I was just going to say, in the case of Paneas, Caesarea Philippi, that I did my dissertation on, it sits at the foot of Mount Hermon, and most people, ministers that preach sermons on that, when they're talking about the establishment of the church, and Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, they don't take into account that, look at where he's at. He's at the foot of Mount Hermon at this shrine to Pan, who was probably Azazel in his original form. And to the east of this place, you got Mount Hermon right there where the Watchers came down first. It's ground zero for the Genesis 6 experiment. To the east, you have Bashan, which at that time was called Battania. This was Og's old kingdom, King Og, the Amorite, the giant. You had the apostate tribe of Dan's territory directly to the west, and then you got these weird. You got Gilgal Rephaim just to the south, and then you also have the recently rediscovered Serpent Mound, which is proximate to that. And so Jesus he picks this location because it's rife with where all of this corruption began, where all this stuff happened. A cursory glance or reading of that misses that completely until you start to dig deeper into it. But yeah, we become so selectively supernatural with the biblical narrative that it's like, well, you can believe in the virgin birth, you can believe in, Moses parting the Red Sea or whatever, but why is it so far of a stretch to believe in this strange interaction between fallen angels and humans, and then the production of these giants?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be.
Shouldn't be.
No, really.
I think this is the weirder stuff is the better stuff. And like, I listen to a lot of Dr. Michael Heiser, and he says the average seminary graduate gets 60 minutes of education on demons and angels. 60 minutes.
Yep.
That's it.
That's about right.
So no wonder so many Christians are confused and people are watching Ancient Aliens. There's literally, you're reading a supernatural story with like 90% of the characters gutted from the story.
Mm-hmm.
So you're left.
How do you reconcile Paul saying that what is unseen is more real than what?
Well, I mean, this whole modern threads of theology, they just debate this stuff. Like, well, I don't really like Paul. I've seen people say that stuff. I don't really like Paul's writings. And I'm like, how can you just, I mean, I get it when it's all, theology, but how can you just delete characters from the story? I don't like Satan. I'm just going to delete it from the story. Do you guys find that a lot with just frustrations with modern day theology when people trying to make sense of the stories? Because if you don't read into the supernatural in the story, you have to kind of delete characters, right? Like, they don't make any sense, so you have to remove them somehow.
Well, Paul frustrated me because I'm here to tell you that his Greek is far more intricate than John's or Peter's, and he made me slam my head against the table more than any of the other New Testament writers.
Well, he had a lot of time to work on his Greek in prison, so he was, he was a master.
But in a good way?
In a good way.
Not in a way where it's like, I don't agree with him theologically.
No, not at all. Not at all. I was just interjecting a little humor.
Nate, I think your point is well taken, though. I think that if you take the supernatural, if you remove that from the biblical narrative, or you just decide to gloss over it, or you decide that you're gonna just cut that out, then you're not left with a lot. And I think your whole point is it's really not a mystery then why people turn to the alien theories, to these other theories where they're trying to rationalize away, these things that maybe can't be rationalized away.
Well, anyone who goes to Peru and looks at those, megalithic structures has to ask themselves harder questions than their pastor has ever asked them, right? You have to. So either you have to go find a pastor that's willing to talk about this stuff, or you have to completely walk away from your Christian faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and for me, that's been one of the cooler things about researching, ancient prehistory and these megalithic structures is I use that as the springboard to bring my friends down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, sure.
These are good guys who they know there's got to be more than they've been led to believe, and they have a biblical worldview, but they know nothing about megalithic history. They know nothing about Genesis 6 or the Nephilim. And so I found it's as simple as showing them some of the crazy megalithic stonework, for example, of Peru, just explaining, simply how, dude, have you ever considered how this is, the Inca could probably not have made this based on these facts, and it gets them thinking. And then I show them a picture of an elongated skull, and they're like, what in the world is that? And then I take them to, Genesis 6, explain how this could really possibly be generations removed of that. And it's always so rewarding when the lights come on, literally after, a conversation or two like this, and then how their faith is so boosted because it connects so many dots.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, wow, the Bible is actually epic. It's like, this is incredible. There's so much more than I was led to believe. And to me, that's always so rewarding. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to bridge that gap with people. And it's always relationally one-on-one.
Sure.
Is do it like that.
Well, Bigfoot was that for me. Like, how does this make sense with everything I've grown up to believe? You know, if this creature's out there and it's and all these stories are true, like, what is this thing? You know, and that kind of opened my mind to the giants, which opened my mind up to, oh, the Bible is way more interesting. And as a whole, see, I think the thing is like, how do we include more of the story together in one cohesive book? Versus, there's a modern way where it's like, let's just pick a few books and make sense of the Bible that way. Whereas the way you guys have been describing, it's like, this is a whole narrative. Every book of the Bible makes sense in this whole narrative. Versus this modern way where it's like, you gotta kick guys like Paul out. You certainly have to kick Satan out, and it's just kind of like Jesus is. That's all we really have to.
Well, Jesus is like a feel good Tony Robbins, right? He's not.
He's a life coach. We turned Jesus into a life coach. Yeah,
because there is no story. You know.
No, but I think the point is, I think it's point well taken. It's a tapestry, right? It's like all of a sudden you see things in 3D. It's, you know, the Old Testament's a lot more like, we always say it's a lot more like Narnia and Middle Earth than it is like anything we really have any context for. And I think that's kind of what that's what Judd was getting at too, saying like, unless you understand the context of the scenery and the imagery and the time and the location and the time and the location of what's going on, this made sense to a first century Jewish person. But if you don't get that, there's no context to it, right? And I think that's what's great about megaliths too. And we go down, we come full circle here with what I think the work that Derek's doing is so important. Is these are some of the biggest you can touch, feel, look at pieces of evidence that still exist for what across the eons of time that say, man, this isn't, it's the story that isn't the real story. The story you've been told isn't the real story. And who you can touch and you can feel and you can look at it and you can't put a hair between that, or this doesn't make sense. This isn't a tomb, or you live in Egypt and you go touch this thing and tell me it doesn't make you feel.
Or there's
weird.
no extension cord that can make it up this mountain.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I love that. What's funny, Luke, is it reminds me of that 80s movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. Remember when
here we go.
The Coke bottle falls down and then they.
This is we have to have an 80s reference, man. This is we have to talk to the little people at least once and a one-off. I got to make fun of you, and then we have to talk about the 80s. And it's funny because I also, just as a side, when I see Judd down here in the corner of my eye, if I just look at it in my peripheral, it looks like Judd's got this like flowing Jesus hair, but it's really just a hood. But
he's a Jedi.
If I look at it real quick, it's like, man, Judd's got some just world-class lettuce, but it's just a hood. So
Judd is the Jedi in this conversation. For those listening, if you could just see the Zoom chat right now, he's got his hood up. And
I guess I am I do sort of have the like I said, Jedi in exile thing going on here.
And Paul and I, here we go. Everything's making sense.
Here's my last question for you guys. Do you feel like we kind of talked about this a little bit with our Doug Van Doren episode? He's a good guy. He's just got us thinking about some things. But he said that in the last 10 to 15 years, more and more people are asking him about giants versus the rest of his life being a pastor. Do you guys see this as there's just more information coming out, or there's like a great awakening happening, or something there's this knowledge is supposed to come out right now and people are talking about it more than ever?
I think that we may be on the cusp of a kind of great awakening. I don't want to wax eschatological, but we are sort of on a prophetic clock. One of the things that sort of busted the door open for this particular view on the ancient world and the prehistoric world was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not like we didn't have copies of Enoch before, but we didn't have them from, I think the earliest copies of Enoch we had were actually Ethiopic. R.H. Charles translation that's so popular I think was originally taken from the Ethiopic. But what was interesting about the Dead Sea Scrolls was its timing. When they were discovered in 1947, Israel becomes a nation. That same time frame, you got on the other side of the world, you got weird stuff like the Roswell incident, the Jack Parsons Babylon workings. It was a time of change of perspective for sure, and we're sort of coming to terms with that. But about the Dead Sea Scrolls material, we get a lot of we get the Jewish confirmation on Enoch's validity, not necessarily canonicity, but certainly validity. And then you got all this other stuff like the Genesis Apocryphon, and Jubilees, and Jasher. It also, in a whole other cache of documents that the Essenes wrote that talk about this world. So yeah, I think we are at the very least poised for a great awakening, and I've kind of been saying that for the last couple of years. My short answer to that would be yes.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny because I tag you in a lot of our photos, Derek, and I didn't even know we were posting some of this stuff. I had no idea that, we would share a similar belief system and kind of discovering all this stuff with the same beliefs of the Bible and what we're trying to do. And it's kind of cool to have you on the show today.
Because it's really cool, Nate. Not just kind of cool, but it's really cool. I'm glad to have you, Derek.
No, I mean it's kind of cool in the sense that it's like something else is sort of making these conversations come together. And I felt like you reached out to me, and I just didn't know, because a lot of these megalithic accounts, you just don't know the person behind it. And you don't know if you share the same ideas, and you don't know if you're pushing the same agendas. And obviously, Luke and I are trying to talk about the giants and stuff. So it was just kind of it's a cool coincidence that maybe not a coincidence. That's what I'm saying.
Very cool, guys. No, it's been fun to connect with you and follow your podcast and now be on it. And I've been a fan of Dr. Judd, so this has been a lot of fun. So I'm just glad to be a part.
Yeah, for me too. Me too.
Yeah, so maybe guys, throw out your websites and how people can find you guys again, and any last thoughts you have and any Jedi wisdom. Just I see it brewing in Judd's eyes there.
Okay. Same as always, burtonbeyond.com. The Institute of Biblical Anthropology, TIOBA.org. People can follow me on Facebook, Twitter. I've got a YouTube channel that I put content up on pretty regularly. I'm also offering a new certification through the Institute. And this kind of in line with what certainly the overarching topic of the show. It's called the Certification in Preternatural Morphology, and that's a fancy way of saying we're studying how demons manifest as monsters. So vampires, werewolves, chimera, revenants.
Oh.
I knew that Jedi wisdom was in there.
Oh.
But it's on sale this week for $175 if people are interested. I've already picked up 3 students this week, so
there you go.
Plenty of room left.
You can find our blog at megalithic.marvels.com. Probably most of the action's over on Instagram. So if you're on Instagram, you can just search for Megalithic Marvels, and lots of photos there. That's kind of a visual platform, and starting to post some new videos on there, which has been exciting. So some interviews, and every once in a while I'll put together a kind of a Megalithic Marvels film. So we got a new one coming up here, hopefully by the weekend, which is going to be exciting, about kind of an obscure megalithic site in Crimea. So if you're on Instagram, check us out there. But like Dr. Judd said, we're also on YouTube. You can find us there, Twitter, Facebook, all that fun stuff. So
cool. Well, thanks guys so much. I mean, it's a huge topic, talking about pyramids and megaliths, and we could probably do 1,000 podcast episodes and still have stuff to talk about. So I appreciate you guys coming on and dropping some of those stories and truths on us, helping us piece together the story of the giants that we talked so much about on our show. Appreciate you guys giving some context to maybe who built these things and where they came from. So
yeah, we're big fans of both of you guys' work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks,
my
guys.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Stay warm down there, Judd.
Yeah.
I have my Jedi robes.
I love it. I actually thought I missed a memo when I jumped on Zoom because all of you were had your heads covered.
Yeah, right.
So I actually grabbed a hat and threw it on real quick.
Oh, it's biblical. We got to cover our heads before we.
Quick.
Yeah. It's very biblical. Right. We're just trying to go by the we're Old Testament here.
Tempt the watchers, Luke. It's nerdy apocrypha jokes or whatever. I don't know. What do you call those? Yeah.
Apocrypha jokes. Yeah, that's a pretty. Yeah,
I love it. Yeah. There's something that needs to go on a T-shirt right there. Coffee mug.
Oh, yeah.
Let's get Dr. Meme on that.
Dr. Meme.
Hey, I'm not a doctor at anything, but you guys are great. Thanks for coming on,
thanks,
and we'll let you know when it goes live. And
yeah.
Hey, thanks,
right.
guys. It was fun.
Thanks so much. Yeah. See you guys.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Godspeed.
Later.